The story of Victoria, Princess Royal, did not begin like that of most women of her era. From the moment she drew her first breath on November 21, 1840, in Buckingham Palace, she was destined not merely to be a princess, but a symbol, an embodiment of ideas, expectations, and the grand project of a new world order shaped by her father, Prince Albert, and her mother, Queen Victoria. She was born into the most powerful monarchy in Europe, the firstborn child of a queen who had only recently ascended to the throne, and of a consort who carried within him the intellectual weight of German idealism, reformist zeal, and unyielding faith in the power of education and morality. Her very name, Victoria, was a proclamation of continuity, of hope renewed through generational ambition. Yet, behind the pomp and pageantry of the British court, the future that lay ahead of her would be defined less by destiny and more by silent battles, against tradition, against prejudice, and against time itself. Her childhood was unlike any lived by a royal child before. Prince Albert, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment and German liberalism, envisioned his children not as ornaments of monarchy but as future stewards of civilization. He believed in shaping the mind through rigor, cultivating moral character, and above all, instilling the principles of duty and progress. Victoria, as his firstborn, became the vessel of these ideals. Her education was intense and exhaustive. She learned multiple languages, studied philosophy, politics, history, and the sciences with tutors selected from the finest minds in Europe. While most girls her age were confined to needlework and etiquette, Victoria was translating Plato and discussing statecraft over breakfast. Her intellect was keen, her memory sharp, and her sense of duty already towering above her years. She was praised for her maturity, chastised for her willfulness, and endlessly compared to her namesake mother and her visionary father. Yet even within the ornate halls of Windsor and the structured serenity of Osborne House, she understood, at a young age, that she was different. The expectations placed upon her were not merely those of a royal daughter, but of a bridge between kingdoms, of a mind trained to act as a lever for reform across continents. In the eyes of Prince Albert, the British monarchy could only survive if it evolved. To him, the destiny of his daughter lay not in passive grandeur but in active influence. He saw her as the first of a new kind of royalty, enlightened, responsible, and capable of reshaping Europe's decaying monarchies from within. And for this mission, he prepared her not only as a student but as a future wife. The marriage he envisioned for her would not be one of romantic whim, but of deep strategic consequence. And so, as early as her 12th year, conversations began about the young Crown Prince of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm, son of Crown Prince Wilhelm and grandson of King Friedrich Wilhelm III. Prussia, at that time, stood as one of the great military powers of continental Europe, governed by a rigid monarchy and a deeply conservative aristocracy. But within its borders also beat a quiet undercurrent of liberalism, a longing for reform that had been crushed in the revolutions of 1848. Friedrich, like Victoria, had been raised differently. His mother, Princess Augusta, was a woman of culture and intelligence. His education had been broad, and his temperament more introspective and moral than martial. It was not only his bloodline but his beliefs that attracted Prince Albert. Here, perhaps, was a kindred spirit to Victoria, a man with the potential to reform an empire from the inside. Their first meeting came during the Great Exhibition of 1851. Though they were still in their early teens, there was a remarkable symmetry between them. Two children of powerful, reform-minded parents, both imbued with idealism, both educated beyond their years. While any notion of affection was premature, the seeds of a future partnership were sown. And as letters were exchanged and diplomatic murmurs grew louder, the idea of uniting Britain and Prussia through this marriage gained ground among liberal thinkers. But the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Within Britain, there was concern about sending the Princess Royal to a country with starkly different political and cultural sensibilities. The British public viewed Prussia with suspicion, often associating its stern militarism and autocracy with repression. In Prussia, the reaction was even more severe. The idea of a British princess, Trained in liberal values and supported by a reformist father, entering the conservative Hohenzollern court was greeted with anxiety and disdain. Yet none of this deterred Prince Albert or Queen Victoria. For them, the personal was deeply political, and Victoria's marriage would be a symbolic act, a torch carried from the British Isles into the heart of Europe. As Victoria approached her 17th year, the engagement became official. On January 25, 1858, she married Friedrich in a ceremony held at St. James's Palace. The public spectacle was immense, a celebration of dynastic union, but beneath the gilded surface was a tide of complex emotions. For Victoria, it was the end of childhood, the beginning of exile, and the assumption of an impossible task: to bring the light of constitutionalism into the iron-wrought corridors of Prussia. When she departed for Berlin, she left behind more than family. She left behind a world where her ideals were cultivated, her intellect was respected, and her influence, though restrained, was appreciated. In Prussia, she would find herself in a court ruled not only by protocol but by hostility. Her British manners were mocked, her progressive ideas scorned, and her very presence treated as an affront to national pride. She was no longer the daughter of the Queen, but Die Engländerin, the Englishwoman, the outsider. Yet she did not shrink. She wrote detailed letters home, describing the stiffness of the court, the petty jealousies, and the brutal resistance to change. She sought solace in books, art, and in the company of Friedrich, who remained her anchor and confidant. Though the court wished to keep her as a silent consort, she quietly began building her own network of intellectuals and reformers. She attended hospitals, supported educational initiatives, and worked to promote the sciences and the arts. In her salons, discussions ranged from constitutional law to medical advancements. But outside her private circles, she remained suspect. At the same time, she began raising her children, not as instruments of power but as thinking individuals. Her firstborn son, Wilhelm, would become a focus of her deepest hopes and deepest sorrows. She sought to instill in him the same principles that had guided her upbringing: intellectual curiosity, empathy, and a belief in limited monarchy. But forces beyond her control were already at work, reshaping his mind and turning him away from her. The death of Prince Albert in 1861 was a blow from which Victoria never truly recovered. Her father had been her architect, her advisor, her greatest supporter. Without him, the world grew colder, and her mission heavier. In letters to her mother, she poured out her anguish, not only personal but philosophical. Without Albert, would Europe still march toward progress? Would her marriage retain its meaning? Would her children ever understand the legacy they were meant to carry? The answers would take decades to unfold. But in the heart of the young princess-turned-crown princess lay a conviction that did not waver. She believed that ideas could transcend borders, that one life lived rightly could shift the course of history. Though the years to come would test her in ways unimaginable, she never abandoned that belief. Her life would be shaped by battles unseen, alliances betrayed, and dreams delayed. But in every step, she carried within her the torch lit in the classrooms of Windsor, the dreams whispered in the halls of Buckingham, and the unshakable legacy of being born the daughter of a queen and a visionary. The world would come to know her by many names: Victoria, the Princess Royal, the Crown Princess of Prussia, the Empress Frederick. But to history, she would remain the royal daughter who tried to change an empire with nothing but her mind, her voice, and her heart. Victoria entered Prussia not as a bride but as a battleground. Beneath the triumphant arches and cheering crowds that greeted her arrival in Berlin in 1858, she sensed the tension that would define her life in this foreign empire. She had left behind a home where liberalism was woven into the political fabric, where constitutional monarchy was the norm, and where her father had nurtured in her a belief that progress and tradition could coexist. In Prussia, she entered a court where hierarchy ruled over thought, where militarism was celebrated as virtue, and where a woman of her mind and background was, from the start, unwelcome. Her wedding to Friedrich had been the beginning of a union carefully crafted to embody ideals of unity and reform, a personal alliance that was meant to grow into a political one. But those ideals began to fray the moment she crossed the threshold of the Prussian court. The Berlin Hof, rooted in centuries of militaristic tradition, had little patience for her British sensibilities. Her efforts to engage in conversation about education, philanthropy, or the arts were met with polite indifference at best, and open disdain at worst. The very court that expected its women to serve as silent ornaments viewed her intellect as dangerous, her questions as intrusive, and her reformist energy as a threat. The hostility did not come in the form of open confrontation but in 1,000 tiny cuts. Snide remarks in drawing rooms, social snubbing at court functions, and relentless gossip in aristocratic salons. She was derided for her accent, mocked for her liberal sympathies, and ridiculed for her English way of dress. Newspapers portrayed her as overbearing, foreign, and meddling. The term Die Engländerin, the Englishwoman, became less a descriptor and more a label of suspicion. But Victoria did not bend. Raised to see herself as an agent of change, she refused to retreat into the shadows. She understood the nature of the resistance she faced, and rather than confront it head-on, she began to carve out her own space within the rigid structures of the court. She initiated reforms in areas she could influence, supporting hospitals, funding scientific research, and establishing educational institutions. She began corresponding with liberal thinkers across Europe, forming intellectual alliances even as political ones eluded her. Behind closed doors, she fostered debate and discussion, slowly cultivating a network of minds who, like her, longed for a different kind of Germany. Her partnership with Friedrich remained her most vital support. Unlike many royal marriages born of political necessity, theirs had grown into a deep and enduring bond. Friedrich admired her mind, relied on her counsel, and shared her vision for a reformed Prussia. He too felt alienated from the authoritarian structures of his heritage and often found solace only in their private conversations. Together, they imagined a future in which the monarchy would no longer rule by decree, but govern through constitution and conscience. Yet even this shared vision was not without its strains. Friedrich was constantly torn between his duties as crown prince and his sympathies as a reformer. He was expected to uphold the traditions of his family and the state, to prove his military credentials, and to maintain a public posture of unflinching loyalty to the existing regime. At times, Victoria's impatience with these contradictions placed pressure on him. She could not understand his reluctance to speak out more forcefully, his hesitations in confronting the old guard. But Friedrich knew better than anyone how quickly resistance could be crushed in the corridors of Berlin. He walked a tightrope, and she, though brilliant, did not always see the winds that threatened to push him off. Despite these tensions, their shared mission endured. They raised their children with an eye toward the future, particularly their eldest son, Wilhelm. From his earliest years, Victoria poured her energy into shaping his mind in the image of Prince Albert's philosophy. She surrounded him with tutors from Britain, insisted on exposing him to art, history, and science, and sought to teach him humility alongside duty. But Wilhelm had been born with a physical deformity, an atrophied left arm that became both a medical concern and a symbolic burden. Victoria's relentless attempts to correct, heal, and improve him created an emotional distance between mother and son. He perceived her efforts as criticism, her intensity as rejection. Even as she tried to prepare him to inherit the dream she and Friedrich shared, Wilhelm began to drift into resentment. Within the palace, the opposition to Victoria and Friedrich was not limited to whispers. The conservative aristocracy, backed by high-ranking military officials and entrenched bureaucrats, viewed the liberal couple as dangerous subversives. At the heart of this resistance stood one towering figure, Otto von Bismarck. Rising through the ranks with ruthless pragmatism and a profound contempt for idealism, Bismarck had little patience for the Princess Royal's humanitarian projects or Friedrich's constitutional sympathies. He saw the future of Germany in blood and iron, not in parliaments or philosophy. His disdain for Victoria was barely concealed, and he worked relentlessly to ensure she remained politically isolated. As the years passed, Victoria became adept at surviving in a court that neither understood nor accepted her. She channeled her frustrations into work, becoming a patron of the arts and a benefactor of hospitals, particularly those focused on women's and children's health. She promoted hygiene reforms, supported scientific institutions, and organized charity drives. Slowly, she earned the respect, if not the affection, of certain segments of Berlin society, particularly among intellectuals and physicians. But the political establishment remained unmoved. In private, Victoria documented everything. Her letters to her mother, Queen Victoria, became a chronicle of emotional survival and political resistance. She wrote with candor about the humiliations she endured, the pettiness of the court, and her fears for the future of her children. Yet despite the pain, her voice never lost its clarity. Her convictions never weakened. She continued to believe that she and Friedrich were the bearers of a better Germany, even if their hopes remained deferred. Tragedy, when it came quietly at first. Friedrich began experiencing hoarseness and discomfort in his throat. At first, it was dismissed as minor, but over time, the symptoms worsened. As the doctors debated, Victoria grew increasingly alarmed. She consulted British specialists, urged biopsies, and pressed for aggressive treatment. What began as a suspected inflammation was eventually diagnosed as something far graver: cancer of the larynx. For Victoria, the diagnosis was not just a medical crisis, it was a political disaster. Friedrich was still the crown prince, but the aging King Wilhelm I could not live forever. If Friedrich ascended the throne as a sick man, or worse, if he never ascended at all, then everything they had worked for could collapse. With Friedrich's voice literally fading, so too would the only voice in the Prussian court that echoed her own. As her husband's condition deteriorated, Victoria was faced with a cruel paradox. The closer she came to the throne, the further it drifted out of reach. In the decades she had spent in Prussia, she had endured humiliation, isolation, and ridicule, all in the belief that one day, she and Friedrich would wield real power. Power to change, to reform, to lift Germany toward a more enlightened path. Now, that moment seemed destined to arrive only when Friedrich was too ill to seize it. Still, she did not yield. She coordinated medical consultations across countries, arranged secret visits by British doctors, and clashed openly with German physicians whom she viewed as too cautious. Her efforts were driven not only by love but by urgency. She knew that history rarely gave second chances. If Friedrich did not recover in time to reign, the throne would pass to their son Wilhelm, who by now had grown into a young man more shaped by the Prussian military than by his mother's ideals. Victoria had once believed that ideas could reshape nations, that a principled mind could guide empires. But in the shadows of the Berlin court, she began to see the limits of idealism. Her marriage to Friedrich had been her refuge, her source of strength, and now it too was under siege by the indifferent cruelty of fate. Still, each day she rose, tended to Friedrich, managed the household, and plotted reforms that might never be enacted. She stood as the silent center of a world slowly unraveling, the last light in a palace of fading hopes. The battles she fought were not with swords, but with telegrams, petitions, and sleepless nights beside a dying man who had once been the future. In the years to come, her courage would be remembered only dimly, her efforts obscured by wars and empires. But in the quiet corridors of Prussian palaces, behind the silken curtains and gilded mirrors, there stood a princess who refused to be broken, not by exile, not by scorn, not even by the slow erasure of everything she had hoped to build. Years passed in Prussia like the slow ticking of a clock whose hands had been frozen by tradition. For Victoria, the promise that had once glittered at the end of her marriage, the hope of becoming a queen consort to a liberal monarch, the belief that she would help steer the largest German power toward constitutional reform, remained always a breath away, never within grasp. Crown Prince Friedrich, her husband, remained dutifully loyal to his aging father, Kaiser Wilhelm I, who defied time and illness to hold onto the throne well into his 90s. The result was a monarchy suspended in stasis, with a reform-minded heir and his English-born wife left to wait in the shadows, watching as opportunities slipped by and the world around them changed. Victoria had long understood that the conservative forces in Prussia would not welcome her reforms with open arms, but she had underestimated just how enduring and immovable those forces could be. She and Friedrich continued to dream together of a Prussia where education flourished, where civil liberties were respected, where the monarchy would modernize and share power rather than dominate. But dreams withered in silence, and silence had become the official language of Berlin's power structures. Otto von Bismarck, now firmly entrenched as the Chancellor of the Empire, had become Victoria's quiet but relentless adversary. He viewed her as meddlesome, arrogant, and dangerously idealistic. To Bismarck, the British-style constitutional monarchy she championed was an existential threat to the authoritarian structure that he had forged, an empire built on military strength, nationalism, and realpolitik. He worked tirelessly to limit her influence, excluding her and Friedrich from major decisions, manipulating Wilhelm I's perceptions, and carefully grooming her son, Wilhelm, to inherit power untainted by his parents' reformist leanings. Victoria's isolation grew more severe as the years dragged on. Her position as crown princess brought with it the semblance of authority but not its substance. She was invited to ceremonies but not to councils, shown off at banquets but kept at arm's length from policy. Her attempts to build a liberal court of her own, filled with artists, scientists, and progressive thinkers, were ridiculed as frivolous and foreign. Her support for public health, women's education, and social welfare was labeled unseemly for a royal woman. The newspapers continued their campaign of mockery, painting her as a foreign interloper trying to impose English ideas on a German state. Even among family, she found little comfort. Her mother-in-law, Augusta, was cool and condescending, often treating Victoria as a political nuisance rather than a fellow royal. And while Friedrich remained her greatest source of emotional strength, he too was trapped by the expectations and constraints of his role. He could not openly defy his father, nor confront Bismarck without risking the fragile stability of the empire. His loyalty to his father often placed him in painful positions, caught between respecting the present and yearning for a better future. This liminal existence between two thrones, between two philosophies, between two eras, gradually took its toll on Victoria. She began to feel like a ghost in her own life, watching the machinery of empire turn without her, watching her ideals wither under the weight of inertia. Yet she refused to give in to bitterness. She documented everything. She wrote hundreds of letters to her mother, Queen Victoria, chronicling not only the personal slights and humiliations she endured but also the slow erosion of political possibilities. Her correspondence became a living archive of liberal resistance in a court dominated by authoritarian certainty. But the deepest wound was yet to come. Not from the court, not from the public, but from within her own home. Her son, Wilhelm, once the object of her most ambitious hopes, was becoming a stranger. Raised with conflicting influences, his mother's liberal ideals and his grandfather's ironclad militarism, Wilhelm gravitated increasingly toward the latter. His disability, a withered left arm caused by birth trauma, had left him insecure, overly defensive, and desperate to prove his strength. He began to resent his mother's Englishness, her constant corrections, her intellectual superiority. The nurturing she offered was interpreted as coddling, her instruction as criticism. Victoria tried everything to reach him. She brought in tutors who embodied the best of the British tradition, exposed him to art and literature, and encouraged him to think independently. But Wilhelm I increasingly surrounded himself with nationalist advisors, military mentors, and conservative theologians. He came to see his mother not as a guiding light but as a shadow he needed to escape. The emotional distance between them widened until it became a chasm. He mocked her British habits, dismissed her social initiatives, and began to adopt the rhetoric of Bismarck and the Prussian establishment. His coldness hurt more than any headline, more than any court insult. Victoria, who had once believed in the transformative power of motherhood, now watched in silent anguish as the heir to the empire became the embodiment of everything she had hoped to reform. Friedrich, too, recognized the shift but struggled to intervene. He loved his son but was increasingly alienated by Wilhelm's arrogance and nationalism. And as Friedrich's own health began to falter, his voice in family matters grew quieter, his influence diminished. The twilight years of Wilhelm I's reign stretched into what felt like an eternity. The old emperor, now in his late 80s, continued to hold court with remarkable resilience, his mind still sharp, his loyalty to Bismarck unwavering. Every year that passed without Friedrich's ascension was another year in which Victoria's dreams languished. The political landscape of Europe shifted around her. France recovered from defeat. Russia modernized, the British Empire expanded, but in Berlin time stood still. Victoria found solace only in her work. She continued to support hospitals and scientific institutions, championing hygienic reform, child welfare, and women's education. Her personal library grew into one of the most comprehensive private collections in the empire. She cultivated friendships with thinkers and doctors, especially those involved in the burgeoning field of bacteriology. She hosted gatherings where the future of medicine, education, and public service was discussed passionately, even if none of those ideas made it into law. She became something of a paradox in the Prussian court, a woman with no power who nevertheless attracted the best minds of the age, a queen-in-waiting who wielded influence through intellect and empathy rather than decree. Yet even these small victories could not mask the growing fear in her heart, that her moment was slipping away, and that her life's purpose might remain unrealized. As the 1880s progressed, Victoria's sense of urgency deepened. She saw in Europe the rise of militarism, nationalism, and imperial competition. She feared that Germany, without reform, would become the powder keg of the continent. She worried that Wilhelm's disdain for diplomacy and fascination with war would lead the empire into catastrophe. Her letters became more urgent, more prophetic. She begged her mother for support, sought alliances with liberal politicians, and wrote impassioned pleas to intellectual journals. But the world did not listen. She was now 50 years old, still intelligent, still elegant, but weary. The lines on her face told the story of 1,000 small defeats, of ambitions deferred, of a woman too far ahead of her time. And as Friedrich began to experience more frequent episodes of fatigue, coughing, and hoarseness, she felt the cruel whisper of fate at her door. The long wait for the throne had turned into a vigil. Behind the palace walls, a quiet tragedy unfolded. A brilliant woman who had once dreamed of changing an empire, now watching that empire slip into the hands of men who saw no need for change. A husband who had once spoken of liberty now struggling to speak at all. A son who had once played beneath her watchful eye now treating her like an adversary. Victoria stood between two thrones, one she had never sat upon, and one she could no longer influence. She stood between generations, between ideals, between what was and what could have been. And still, she did not abandon her post. Still, she hoped. Still, she believed that history could be bent, even if only slightly, by the will of a woman who refused to be silent. By the early months of 1887, the days had grown shorter, but for Victoria, time had begun to stretch unbearably thin. The vision she had carried for decades, the hope that her husband Friedrich would ascend the throne and bring with him a breath of reform into the stale corridors of the German Empire, was now haunted by. Why the cruel ticking of two clocks? One belonged to Wilhelm I, still living, still sovereign despite his advanced age. The other belonged to Friedrich himself, whose hoarseness had long ceased to be merely troubling and was now a whisper of something far more sinister. The first signs had come quietly, like background noise in a room already filled with distractions. A cough that lingered, a throat that strained after public engagements, a fatigue that seemed stubbornly immune to rest. But as the symptoms grew more persistent, so did Victoria's worry. Her instincts sharpened by years of emotional vigilance, She suspected what the German physicians around her hesitated to admit. The discomfort in Friedrich's throat was not merely irritation, it was disease. And worse, it was growing. When the first tentative diagnosis of laryngeal cancer was proposed, felt less like news and more like confirmation. The very organ that symbolized Friedrich's voice, his capacity to rule, to inspire, to challenge, was under siege. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, reacted not with panic but with action. She sent for British specialists, consulted the finest surgeons in London, and meticulously researched every available treatment. She had long understood that in the game of empires, information was power, and now information might be the only weapon she had left to save both her husband and their shared political dream. But Prussia was no place for foreign medicine, nor for foreign interference. The German medical establishment, conservative, hierarchical, and deeply suspicious of British approaches, resisted every suggestion she made. They insisted on their own evaluations, denied the necessity of aggressive measures, and discouraged outside consultation. Some of them, intentionally or not, sought to delay rather than cure. Victoria's requests for surgery were met with caution and deference to the court's decorum. Her proposals were treated as panic, her urgency as hysteria. Friedrich, caught between the woman he loved and the advisors he had grown up obeying, struggled to mediate. He too feared what was happening inside him, but years of conditioning had taught him not to question authority, not even when that authority came wearing a doctor's coat. First, he deferred to the official physicians. But as his condition worsened, as his voice began to fade into an airy rasp, he looked increasingly to Victoria for guidance. The couple traveled to San Remo in Italy, seeking warmth, rest, and perhaps the clarity of distance. Their British doctors finally conducted a biopsy. The results confirmed Victoria's worst fears: cancer of the larynx. The diagnosis was not merely a medical verdict, it was a political sentence. It meant that if Friedrich ever became emperor, he might be too weak to act. It meant that the throne, so long awaited, might come not with the power to change history but only with the cruel irony of being a prison of silence. Back in Berlin, the political vultures began to circle. Bismarck, whose genius lay in timing as much as strategy, began quietly preparing for a future that did not include Friedrich's vision of reform. He tightened his grip on Wilhelm, nurturing the prince's distrust of his parents and reinforcing his loyalty to the military elite. Bismarck ensured that every delay in Friedrich's treatment, every whisper of uncertainty, worked to his benefit. He knew that time was on his side, and that for Victoria it was quickly running out. Wilhelm I, still miraculously alive, had become a symbol of cruel continuity. At 90 years old, the emperor remained alert, issuing commands and receiving ambassadors with undiminished authority. To the outside world, it seemed a miracle of longevity. But to Victoria, it felt like a divine jest, a reminder that the gates of change remained closed, even as her husband's strength ebbed. By early 1888, Friedrich could no longer speak. He communicated through writing, his once commanding voice now reduced to scribbled notes and mournful glances. The man who had once dreamed aloud of a constitutional Germany now lived in whispers and pain. Victoria, ever beside him, transformed herself into his voice, his nurse, his strategist, and his advocate. She translated his wishes, coordinated his treatments, and managed his affairs. But with each passing day, she could feel his spirit waning, not from cowardice but from exhaustion. When Kaiser Wilhelm I finally died on March 9, 1888, the moment Victoria had waited for nearly 30 years finally arrived. But it did not come as triumph. Came as dread. Friedrich was now the German emperor, but he was also a dying man. Victoria became empress consort, but the crown sat atop a head bowed with grief and anticipation of loss. There were no sweeping reforms, no declarations of a new era. Only quiet ceremonies and polite words from a man who could no longer address his people aloud. The imperial court entered a strange twilight. Ministers, nobles, and generals filed in and out, offering condolences laced with calculation. They bowed to Friedrich with solemnity, But many knew his reign would be short. Some even hoped it would be. For them, the future lay with Wilhelm, strong in body, forceful in rhetoric, and untouched by the liberal sympathies of his parents. Victoria, who should have been at the center of national celebration, instead found herself managing a dying man's legacy. Still, she acted. She and Friedrich spent every hour discussing what could still be done. Laws to be reviewed, appointments to be made, ideas to be preserved. She tried to push forward changes in education policy, in press freedoms, in social welfare. But she encountered resistance at every level. Ministers hesitated to act on the commands of an emperor they believed would soon die. Bismarck quietly advised patience and continuity. And Victoria, no matter how determined, could not sign edicts herself. Her worst fear was not that Friedrich would die, but that he would die unheard. That the years they had waited would culminate not in a revolution of ideas, but in a funeral procession. That Germany would forget what could have been. And so she wrote. She chronicled his thoughts, archived his letters, annotated his speeches, and prepared his legacy for a future that might still listen. If the court would not hear Friedrich, perhaps history would. Friedrich's reign lasted only 99 days. It was a reign without power, without voice, without the chance to implement the liberal dream he had carried for a lifetime. When he died on June 15, 1888, Victoria's world collapsed. Not with noise, but with unbearable silence. Her partner, her ally, her co-reformer was gone, and in his place rose Wilhelm II, a man shaped by rejection, driven by ambition, and molded by those who had always feared what Victoria and Friedrich stood for. The throne had waited, but it had waited too long. The crown had come, but it had come as a shroud. And Victoria, now the Dowager Empress, was left not with power, but with memory, with the burden of being the last witness to a future that never arrived. The summer of 1888, known to history as the Year of the Three Emperors, cast a pall over the German Empire like a heavy, unmoving cloud. For Victoria, it was a season suspended in grief and urgency, where each breath drawn beside her dying husband was weighed against a lifetime of dreams. She had fought, she had waited, she had endured, and now, as Friedrich lay speechless in his imperial chambers, ravaged by cancer, the silence she feared more than anything else closed in around them both. The disease had stolen Friedrich's voice, but not his mind. Each day he remained alert, aware of the disintegration happening within him, aware of the throne beneath him and the history slipping through his fingers. He could no longer address his ministers, no longer rally his people, no longer stand tall as a symbol of change. Instead, he scribbled thoughts in notebooks, communicated in whispers and notes, and depended entirely on Victoria to be his mouthpiece, his memory, and his strength. Victoria rose to this task with a mixture of stoic determination and quiet despair. She had lived much of her life as a political outsider, denied the influence her intellect deserved, mocked for her Englishness, and kept from power by patriarchal traditions and political inertia. Now, in the waning days of her husband's life, she found herself not only his caregiver, but his advocate in a palace that had already begun to shift its allegiance toward the next emperor, her son. Her days became a pattern of exhaustion and vigilance. She sat beside Friedrich's bed, recording his thoughts, transcribing his barely legible notes, managing his medications, and fighting off both resignation and rage. She maintained an outward calm that belied the storm within her. For she knew that the real battle was no longer for Friedrich's life. It was for his legacy. What would survive him? Who would speak for what he had believed in? What future awaited the Germany he had hoped to reshape? In the corridors of power, silence reigned. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of anticipation. Ministers no longer brought forward bold policies. Civil servants hesitated to act. The press, ever vigilant, tiptoed around the reality that the emperor was dying, speaking in euphemisms, offering thinly veiled hope. But everyone knew the truth. The crown had passed to a man whose body could not bear it, and behind the heavy doors of Charlottenburg Palace, his wife stood alone against the tides. Otto von Bismarck, as always, remained several steps ahead. He had already begun to marginalize Victoria, closing off lines of communication, limiting her access to key advisors, and ensuring that no major decisions passed through her hands. He discouraged ministers from meeting with her in private and warned the court against initiating policy under the authority of a ruler who might not live to see its consequences. He positioned himself as the steward of continuity, the only man who could safely navigate the empire through its uncertain transition. Victoria knew this. She knew that Bismarck's genius lay not only in manipulation, but in patience. He had outlived movements, kings, and revolutions. Now he was preparing to outlive her husband's ideals as well. Every hour she spent at Friedrich's bedside was an hour lost in the political arena where her presence had never been fully welcome. But she refused to yield. In private correspondence, she reached out to reformist allies, pleaded with British diplomats, and kept meticulous records of Friedrich's wishes. She planned to publish his writings, to memorialize his thoughts, to preserve in ink what he could no longer speak aloud. It was not a reign, it was a vigil, and throughout it, there was Wilhelm, her son, waiting in the wings, once the center of her hopes, now the embodiment of her greatest fears. His visits to his father were infrequent and uncomfortable. He arrived with stiffness, offered perfunctory sympathy, and departed with clipped phrases. He made no effort to conceal his desire for the throne, nor his impatience with his mother's efforts to speak on Friedrich's behalf. His disdain for her British influences had curdled into something sharper, an ideological rejection, a personal repudiation. Wilhelm had long since ceased to be a son molded by her hand. He had been claimed by the generals, by the nationalists, by Bismarck's vision of a strong, centralized, militarized Germany. He no longer saw his mother's liberalism as a noble ideal, but as a weakness, a foreign infection in the blood of the empire. Her tears, her resolve, her vision, all of it was irrelevant to him. He believed in destiny, but not hers. Victoria saw this unfolding and yet held her ground. She had failed to win over the court, perhaps even failed to shape her son, but she would not fail Friedrich. Not now, not when every hour of breath was precious. She read to him each day, relayed letters from supporters, updated him on the court, and whispered reminders of the Germany they had once dreamed together. She reminded him that their lives had meant something, even if history chose to forget it. Outside the palace, the world moved forward. Industrialization marched on, railways expanded, and the German economy surged. But inside those imperial walls, the most powerful empire in Europe was being governed by silence, by pen and paper, by the trembling hands of a dying man and the steady presence of his wife. On June 15, 1888, Friedrich died in Potsdam. Victoria held his hand as the last of his breath slipped away, her heart breaking not only for the man she loved, but for the ideals he had carried. In that moment, she felt the great silence descend, not just the absence of his voice, but the loss of a future that would never come. The emperor was dead. The brief, stilled reign of Friedrich III had ended before it ever truly began. Within hours, the court shifted its allegiance to Wilhelm II. The ministers who had once bowed to her now turned cold. The corridors that had echoed her footsteps for 30 years became hostile terrain. She was no longer needed, no longer heeded. The son she had raised moved into power with confidence and speed, making clear that his reign would not be an extension of his parents, but a rejection of it. Victoria, now the Dowager Empress, withdrew to Friedrichshof, the residence she had built for herself and her husband. There, surrounded by memories and mourning, she began the final act of her life, not as an empress but as a witness. She gathered Friedrich's letters, published his diaries, and wrote her own reflections. If Germany would not honor his legacy, she would inscribe it into the conscience of history. She continued to support the causes they had once championed: medicine, education, the arts. But her influence, once only limited, was now non-existent. She was tolerated, pitied, and occasionally scorned. The woman who had once believed she could change an empire now lived in the quiet of exile within her own country. But she never stopped writing. She never stopped believing that ideas mattered. And she never stopped loving the man who had once whispered to her that even thrones must bow before truth. In the silence that followed Friedrich's death, Victoria found a different kind of voice, one forged not by proclamations, but by endurance. She became the memory keeper of a future that never came, the last living echo of a vision lost to time. And though the empire marched onward under a new banner, though war clouds gathered on the horizon, and though her own legacy would be twisted by gossip and forgotten by textbooks, she remained what she had always been, not just a princess, not just an empress, but a woman who had loved, and believed and endured. The imperial proclamation came like a murmur rather than a thunderclap. On March 9, 1888, the death of Kaiser Wilhelm I ended a reign that had defined an era, and Friedrich, his son, ascended the throne as Friedrich III. But there was no parade, no triumphant declarations, no sweeping reforms. Instead, the German Empire stepped into a reign already overshadowed by illness, by brevity and by fate. Victoria, standing beside her husband at the moment the crown was passed, felt none of the elation she had once imagined. The throne they had waited for, fought for, dreamed of, now felt like a scaffold, hastily built and doomed to collapse. Friedrich's body had become a prison. The cancer had taken away his voice, and along with it, his ability to project leadership in a world that still equated power with presence. His strength waned rapidly. He could barely speak, could hardly stand, and could not command. And yet, within the confines of his sick room, he tried. Each morning, with Victoria's help, he reviewed documents, met with advisors, wrote notes to ministers, and attempted to draft the outlines of the reforms he had once promised. But the palace around him had already moved on. Ministers bowed, nodded, and quietly deferred. Few truly believed his reign would last. Bureaucrats waited for the next chapter, the real chapter, when Wilhelm II would assume the throne with vigor and youth. Bismarck, ever the architect of power, played both sides, appearing to support the ailing emperor while positioning himself as the indispensable constant for the future. Every gesture of loyalty was a performance, every act of deference a placeholder. Victoria saw it all. She sat beside Friedrich day and night, interpreting his hoarse whispers, transcribing his thoughts, relaying his orders. She became not merely his wife, but his cabinet, his messenger, his voice. Through her, he attempted to advocate for press freedom, judicial reform, and military restraint. Through her, he summoned what authority remained to try to shift the empire toward a gentler path. But her influence, already fragile before, now faced a wall of doubt, cynicism, and passive resistance. The court did not take her seriously. Her political instincts were ignored, her policy knowledge dismissed. Her Englishness remained a convenient excuse for marginalization, and her presence at Friedrich's side was tolerated only because of the emperor's condition. Behind closed doors, whispers spread that she was overreaching, meddling, even manipulating her dying husband. And worse still, she was feared, not for the power she had, but for the power she might still seize if left unchecked. Bismarck made sure she was kept out of crucial meetings. Key decisions were delayed until Wilhelm could be consulted. The government began to operate in a holding pattern, awaiting the inevitable end. And yet, Victoria continued. She urged Friedrich to write letters, to sign documents, to issue symbolic proclamations even if their legal force was weak. She helped him draft a manifesto, never officially released, calling for political reform and restraint of executive power. She guarded his writings, his thoughts, his legacy, as if they were sacred artifacts. But time was not on her side. Each day, Friedrich's health declined. His pain increased. Morphine dulled the worst of it, but also clouded his clarity. There were moments when he drifted into semi-consciousness, when he could no longer focus on the papers before him, when even the smallest effort drained him. Victoria, exhausted and heartbroken, hid her tears until nightfall. She had lost the man she loved by degrees. First his health, then his speech, and now, moment by moment, his presence. And then there was Wilhelm, the crown prince, already preparing for his own reign, had no patience for the dying emperor or for his mother's persistence. He treated Victoria's actions as obstruction, her intentions as self-serving. He began to assert himself at court, meeting privately with officials, signaling that a new direction was imminent. Victoria, long estranged from her son's inner world, now found herself politically opposed to him. What had once been a familial tragedy was now a dynastic rift. The friction between mother and son was more than personal, it was ideological. Wilhelm believed in military power, in autocratic rule, in national glory. He rejected everything his parents had stood for. The more Victoria tried to preserve Friedrich's legacy, the more Wilhelm distanced himself from it. And so, even before her husband had died, Victoria saw her influence disintegrate under the looming shadow of her own child. In those final weeks, the palace became a place of tension and quiet mourning. Visitors arrived and departed with cautious faces. Doctors whispered in corners. Journalists speculated from afar. The German people, unsure of what was happening behind the curtained windows, waited in uncertainty, and Friedrich, too weak to walk, too weary to write, simply endured. He endured in silence. Victoria remained. She held his hand. She read to him from Goethe, from Cicero, from the scriptures. She spoke softly of their early days, of their children, of the dreams they had shared. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he wept. But mostly he simply listened. On June 15, 1888, after 99 days on the throne, Friedrich III died. Victoria did not cry at first. There was too much to do. She arranged the funeral, coordinated with foreign dignitaries, managed correspondence. She ensured that Friedrich would be buried with dignity, surrounded by symbols of peace and learning, not just military honors. She oversaw the archiving of his papers, the organization of his diaries, and the preservation of his final writings. But when the crowds dispersed, when the palace fell quiet, when the throne was handed without pause to Wilhelm II, then, in the solitude of Friedrichshof, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for a husband, not just for an emperor, but for a vision, possibility, a Germany that might have been. In the years that followed, historians would debate the significance of Friedrich's reign. Some called it tragic, others irrelevant. Some said he had no time to govern, others said he lacked the will. But Victoria knew the truth. His reign had not failed because of inaction or weakness. It had failed because it was never truly allowed to begin. It was not Friedrich who lacked time, it was the empire that lacked courage. And so she dedicated herself to remembering. She catalogued every letter, every speech, every policy draft. She published his thoughts, defended his character, and reminded the world that even a brief flicker of light mattered in the long shadow of history. He had ruled for 99 days, but in her heart, his reign would last forever. In the weeks following Friedrich's death, the halls of the German imperial court underwent a transformation so swift, so deliberate, that it felt almost rehearsed. Portraits of the late emperor were respectfully lowered, documents bearing his signature were quietly archived, and the machinery of state power began grinding once again under a new hand. Wilhelm II, at the age of 29, was now the German emperor and king of Prussia. He stepped into the role with the vigor of youth, the confidence of inheritance, and the deep desire to cast off everything his parents had ever stood for. For Victoria, the transition was not merely a change in rulers. It was an erasure. The ideals she had carried into Prussia from her girlhood in England, the decades of careful advocacy she had pursued beside Friedrich, the dream of a constitutional monarchy rooted in reason, education, and compassion. All of it began to vanish beneath the iron tread of her own son's ambition. Her place in the imperial court diminished overnight. She was no longer an empress consort, nor even a dowager with meaningful influence. She was an inconvenience, a relic, a reminder of an alternative path the empire had declined to take. Wilhelm wasted no time in defining the character of his rule. He made it clear that the restraint his father had envisioned would not be the hallmark of his reign. He rejected the idea of co-governance with ministers and parliaments, favoring instead a centralized authority vested entirely in himself. He saw monarchy not as stewardship, but as command. In speeches, he invoked divine right. In policy, he embraced militarization and expansion. He surrounded himself with generals, industrialists, and nationalist intellectuals. He disbanded or sidelined the advisors who had once whispered cautious progress into his father's ear. The storm that had long gathered behind Victoria now broke over her. Their estrangement, once private and painfully domestic, became political and public. Wilhelm began to make critical remarks about his parents in his inner circle. He dismissed his father's reforms as weak and un-German. He referred to his mother's British sensibilities with disdain, treating her not as a foundational figure in the empire but as a foreign agent whose presence had weakened the crown. The press followed suit. Conservative publications painted her as the meddling Englishwoman who had tried to import unworkable ideas into the proud German court. Victoria, long used to isolation, now became the target of quiet hostility. Her requests for audiences were delayed. Her letters to ministers went unanswered. Her influence over state affairs was not merely reduced, it was methodically erased. She had once hoped that, in Friedrich's absence, she could serve as a guardian of his legacy, a regent in memory if not in title. But Wilhelm II would not allow even that. The very mention of his father's short reign became taboo in court. The liberal manifesto Friedrich had begun was locked away. His reforms were shelved, his ideals buried alongside his body. Victoria retreated to Friedrichshof, the residence she had built for herself and Friedrich years earlier. It stood on a gentle rise in the Taunus Mountains, surrounded by forests and silence. There, she created a sanctuary of memory, a private court where Friedrich's portrait still hung above the mantel, where his books remained untouched on the shelves, and where his voice lingered in letters, journals, and fading echoes. It was not merely a home, it was a monument to a lost future. But even there, she was not free from the empire. Wilhelm's disdain followed her through edicts and social signals. Her visitors were watched. Her correspondence was monitored. When foreign diplomats called, their visits were noted and quietly discouraged. Her role as a grandmother was complicated by political tension. She was kept at arm's length from her grandchildren, her guidance unwelcome. The woman who had once dreamed of raising enlightened rulers was now viewed as a subversive influence within her own bloodline. And yet, Victoria did not stop resisting. She poured her energy into writing, compiling her husband's papers, publishing select memoirs, and ensuring that the record of his ideals would not vanish. She corresponded with British newspapers, maintained relationships with liberal scholars, and offered patronage to reformist causes in science and education. She sponsored hospitals, founded schools, and supported women's training programs. Though her reach was limited, her principles remained steady. Her resistance had moved from the court to the page, from decree to documentation. Privately, she suffered. Her health, long neglected in the years of Friedrich's illness and her own political stress, began to decline. She experienced chest pain, fatigue, and a chronic cough. Doctors offered platitudes, but she understood what was happening. Like Friedrich, she had begun the long process of dying by degrees. But she refused to give in. The legacy had to be preserved, not for her sake, nor even for Friedrich's, but for history's, for the idea that somewhere in the German Empire had once lived a vision of governance tempered by restraint and ruled by principle. She watched from a distance as Wilhelm accelerated toward a different future. His speeches grew more bombastic, his military parades more elaborate, his foreign policy more aggressive. The culture of the court became one of spectacle and strength, of uniforms and steel. Victoria saw it for what it was, a performance built on insecurity, a nation striding toward the edge with no voice to pull it back. And she saw, with a mother's heartbreak, that her son, The boy she had once cradled, once taught, once dreamed over was now the engine of that momentum. She did not write to him often. When she did, the replies were short and formal. The warmth between them had long since cooled into ritual. He treated her as a dignitary from another era, a fossilized figure best left undisturbed. And she, for all her sorrow, had learned to accept it. Her love remained, but it no longer reached him. Still she wrote. In journals, in letters never sent, in margins and annotations. She recorded her fears, her memories, her hopes long dashed. She wrote about Friedrich's last days, about their conversations, about his belief that even the smallest rain could send ripples through time. She wrote about Wilhelm's childhood, about the moment she first realized he would not follow their path. And she wrote about herself, not as a queen, not as an empress, but as a woman who had once believed the world could be softened by intelligence and conscience. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she wondered if she had been wrong. Had she mistaken idealism for possibility? Had she overestimated her power, her role, her reach? Had the empire ever truly been willing to change? Or had it merely tolerated her presence as long as she remained harmless? But doubt, while persistent, never became dominant. For Victoria, to question was natural, but to abandon belief was impossible. Even as Wilhelm marched the empire toward uncertainty, even as her body betrayed her, she held to the conviction that what she and Friedrich had tried to build still mattered. That the story was not over simply because it had been silenced. She began organizing her papers more methodically, preparing them not just for family, but for posterity. She catalogued Friedrich's writings, annotated his letters, and prepared them for future historians. She instructed that they be protected, even if publication would take years. If the present could not absorb their meaning, perhaps the future would. The storm her son unleashed continued to grow. Across Europe, tensions mounted, alliances strained, and the machinery of militarism tightened. Victoria, watching from the quiet of Friedrichshof, saw the storm coming long before the world did. And in that solitude, she realized that the greatest act of resistance left to her was not to shout, but to remember. Not to command, but to endure. Not to fight the empire, but to record its alternate path. She had lost her throne. She had lost her husband. She had lost her son. But she had not lost her purpose. By the dawn of the 1890s, the widow of the German emperor lived not in a palace of marble and gold, but in a quiet manor nestled in the hills of Hesse, Friedrichshof. Built as a labor of love in honor of her husband, it had become both her sanctuary and her battlefield. There, far from Berlin's noise and politics, Victoria continued her fight. No longer at the center of power, she wielded no scepter, issued no decree. But what she held now was far more subversive: memory. The German Empire no longer remembered Friedrich III as a ruler. 99 days had been too brief for monuments, too short for textbooks. In the official narrative spun by Wilhelm II and his court, Friedrich was reduced to a footnote, an interlude between two true emperors. Victoria knew this version of history was false. She knew the man who had whispered reforms while dying, who had scribbled ideas between coughing fits, who had tried to redirect a nation's soul from beneath a death sentence. And she refused to let him be forgotten. Friedrichshof became more than a home. It became an archive. Victoria poured her remaining strength into the preservation of her husband's life and thought. She had every document copied, every speech annotated, every private letter placed into order. She began writing a comprehensive chronicle, part memoir, part biography, part political reflection. It was not merely nostalgia. It was resistance in prose. She was curating an alternative history, one that would outlast the propaganda of her son's court and the silence imposed upon her. She was not alone in this endeavor. Though stripped of political influence, she remained a magnet for thinkers, reformers, and physicians. Scholars from Britain, France, and even some from cautious corners of Germany made pilgrimages to Friedrichshof. In salons lit by candlelight and animated by debate, Victoria continued to champion the causes she and Friedrich had once held dear: science, education, civic responsibility, the restraint of power through wisdom. She especially focused on the advancement of women. In her younger years, her advocacy had been subtle, couched in language palatable to a male-dominated court. But now, with no audience to appease, she spoke plainly. She financed nursing schools, supported women's higher education, and promoted hygiene and medical training for girls. Her experiences in the oppressive Prussian court had revealed to her not only the limits of political power, but the structural barriers faced by women of all classes. In letters and lectures, she described the need for a new generation of women who would not be content with embroidery and etiquette. She also remained deeply involved in the world of medicine. Having watched Friedrich suffer under the contradictions of nationalist medical pride and outdated treatment, she became a patron of international collaboration in health sciences. She funded bacteriology research, supported public health campaigns, and organized hospital improvements based on British models. Her name rarely appeared on the banners, but her donations, her networks, and her tireless correspondence created ripples across a field that was slowly transforming the lives of millions. Even as her health began to fail, her letters continued. She wrote to Queen Victoria in England, to liberal politicians in France, to journalists and historians and doctors. She wrote not out of nostalgia, but out of strategy. Each letter was an attempt to preserve a piece of what had been lost, to inject clarity into the fog of history being rewritten by the empire her son now ruled. Wilhelm II, for his part, did not confront her directly. He had won the throne, secured the loyalty of the military, and was basking in the glories of Germany's industrial rise. But he feared her presence. Not because she posed a political threat, he had stripped her of that long ago, but because she reminded the empire of what it might have been. As long as she lived, the myth of inevitable strength was haunted by the ghost of compassion. And Victoria, though exiled in all but name, understood this. She cultivated that haunting, not through bitterness, but through calm, persistent defiance. She made Friedrich's writings available to select scholars. She commissioned careful translations. She sent handwritten notes to young students who quoted his speeches. She curated memory the way others curated museums, not for preservation alone, but for eventual resurrection. Privately, she wrestled with her mortality. The cough had worsened. The fatigue deepened. Doctors offered vague reassurances, but Victoria, having watched illness claim so many, knew the signs. She had breast cancer. It was a cruel irony, another echo of her husband's suffering. But she greeted the diagnosis not with despair, but with resolve. If death was coming, she would meet it the same way she had met everything since arriving in Prussia as a teenager, with discipline, courage, and purpose. She accelerated her writing. She spent hours in her library, going through volumes of Friedrich's thoughts, her own diaries, and the history she had lived. She directed the completion of Friedrichsthof's chapel and ensured that it would be his final resting place. She chose the inscription for his tomb carefully, not to glorify power, but to echo his values. It read not of titles or conquests, but of duty and light. And as the 19th century drew to a close, Victoria began to see the outlines of another storm forming on the horizon. She read the speeches of nationalist politicians, watched with concern as Germany armed itself with confidence, and sensed that Wilhelm's restless ambition was leading the empire into dangerous waters. She could not stop it, but she could leave behind a record so that when the storm broke, someone somewhere would remember there had once been another path. In her final years, she received fewer visitors, but never gave up the role of teacher. To the young nurses she mentored, she spoke of human dignity. To visiting scholars, she offered warnings against the worship of empire. To her grandchildren, when she was allowed to see them, she told stories not of crowns and battles, but of ideas, of mistakes, of how history is built not by generals, but by those who choose whether or not to listen. She was no longer young. Her frame had grown thin, her step unsteady. But in her face remained the clarity of purpose that had defined her entire life. She had once walked into Prussia as a girl full of promise. Now, she was leaving it not as a queen, nor as a political victor, but as a chronicler of what might have been. Her crusade had not changed the empire, but it had changed the record, and in the end that too was power. The winter of 1900 arrived at Friedrichshof with a silence heavier than snow. The house stood as it always had, quiet, disciplined, orderly. But inside its stone walls, the woman who had once dreamed of reshaping an empire now prepared to leave the world on her own terms. Victoria, once a royal daughter, a crown princess, an empress for 99 days, now lived in the soft, gray twilight between memory and mortality. Her breast cancer had advanced. The pain was constant, her strength diminished by the day. Yet her mind, astonishingly sharp, remained her most enduring asset. She could no longer travel, no longer give audiences, no longer climb the stairs without help. But she could still write, and so she did. From a quiet room warmed by a single fireplace and filled with the scent of old paper and lavender, Victoria began to compose what would be the final campaign of her life. A collection of letters, notes, reflections, and messages, some addressed, some unsigned, many never to be mailed. These were not political manifestos nor royal correspondences. They were whispers to the future, dispatches from the margins of empire. They were her last act of authorship in a world that had largely written her out. She wrote to her mother, though Queen Victoria had already passed. She described how much she missed her voice, her strength, her presence in the great questions of the age. She recalled their arguments, their shared griefs, and the deep bond that had often been strained but never severed. She thanked her for the principles that had shaped her. She asked for forgiveness for the things she could not fix. The letter was never meant for delivery. It was a reckoning between one queen and another, across time and silence. She wrote to Friedrich, not with mourning, but with conversation. She told him of the trees outside the window that he had once planted, of the nurses who still kept his books dusted, of the children they had raised and how each had wandered so far from the path they once dreamed. She spoke of their son Wilhelm, not with bitterness, but with sorrow. She told Friedrich what he already knew, that the boy had become a man who had turned away from their hopes, who now governed not with light, but with shadow. She wrote to her grandchildren, some of whom she rarely saw, others who had been instructed to keep their distance. She wrote of love, of duty, of history. She warned them, gently, firmly, that titles were illusions if not tempered by responsibility, that power unexamined was the fastest path to ruin. She asked them to read their grandfather's journals. She asked them to read anything. Empires do not collapse from invasion, she wrote in one letter, but from amnesia. She wrote to the historians she hoped would one day find her papers. She explained her decisions, clarified her intentions, and catalogued her failures. She did not glorify her role. She did not pretend to have succeeded, but she insisted over and over again that she and Friedrich had tried. We believed that a gentler Germany was possible, she wrote. We did not expect applause, only the chance to begin. And she wrote to Wilhelm. This letter she began many times. It was the most difficult to write, not because the feelings were unclear, but because the audience was closed. She had known for years that her son had hardened his heart toward her. Their political differences had long calcified into personal distance. But a mother's love is not so easily dismissed. She wrote not to persuade, but to bear witness. She reminded him of his childhood, the long walks, the bedtime readings, the way she once hoped he would be the first emperor educated in compassion. She admitted the mistakes she had made, the pressures, the expectations, the moments when her hopes had become burdens. She did not excuse herself. She simply asked that he remember her as more than a political figure, more than a foreign-born critic. I was your mother, she wrote, and I believed you could be better than all of us. The letter was never sent. She folded it carefully and placed it in a bundle tied with blue ribbon, alongside letters to Friedrich, her mother, and her daughters. These were not public documents. They were a legacy meant for the quiet reader, the future historian, the grandchild who might one day ask, what did she think when everything changed? As her body continued to fail, she spoke less but listened more. When visitors came, she received them with warmth but little ceremony. She no longer had the energy for formalities. She asked questions about their work, their lives, the state of the world. She encouraged them to write, to reflect, to act with integrity. She gave away books by the stack. She made donations through intermediaries. She read reports on German military expansion with a furrowed brow and underlined passages in newspapers that foreshadowed disaster. To those who asked if she still believed in reform, she answered simply, more than ever. She knew what was coming. The empire was growing louder, more rigid, more prideful. She saw in Wilhelm's posture the same blind confidence that had undone nations for centuries. She saw a Europe building toward a reckoning it did not yet understand. And she knew she would not live to see it. But perhaps, she thought, if the letters remained, someone else would. In her final weeks, her world narrowed to one room, one window, one bed. Her pain was managed with laudanum, her breathing shallow. But her eyes, when open, were alert, piercing, unwavering. She did not flinch from death. She had sat with it too often, seen it too closely, studied it too deeply. On August 5, 1901, Victoria, Dowager Empress of Germany and Queen of Prussia, passed away at Friedrichshof. She was 60 years old. The funeral was modest. Wilhelm did not linger. The press offered short obituaries, framed her life in terms of loss, of failure, of distance. But within the walls of her study, in the pages she had preserved, another story remained. The story of a woman who had come to a foreign land at 17 believing she could change the course of an empire. The story of a wife who had sat beside a dying emperor and tried to keep his vision alive. The story of a mother who had lost her son to power but never to memory. And above all, the story of a writer who knew that when all else fades, the last thing left is the record. She was buried beside Friedrich in the chapel at Friedrichshof, beneath a modest stone carved not with titles, but with words of quiet devotion. Outside, the empire marched on. Wilhelm II remained on the throne. Berlin's streets bustled with industry, and the war machines of Europe creaked ominously toward catastrophe. In the capital, there were no state monuments commissioned in her honor, no national days of mourning. Her death was a moment noted, not remembered. And yet, in the soft silence of history's long corridors, her presence lingered. Victoria, firstborn of Queen Victoria, wife of an emperor, mother to another, had never worn her crown in full. The moment was stolen from her by illness, by politics, by time. But she had worn something far heavier than gold and velvet, the weight of ideals in a world not yet ready to receive them. She had entered Prussia at 17, armed with books and conviction, believing she could shape a different kind of monarchy, one rooted not in dominance but in conscience. She had married for strategy but loved for truth. She had endured suspicion, exile, rejection, and grief not with bitterness, but with an unshakable belief that ideas, once planted, could outlive power. Friedrich's 99-day reign faded quickly from public memory, eclipsed by the flamboyant and bellicose rule of his son. But Victoria's quiet labor of documentation, the journals, the letters, the reflections she had preserved with such care, waited patiently for their moment. It would come not in her lifetime, nor in Wilhelm's, but in the shadows that followed the First World War. When Germany fell into ruin after 1918, when the monarchy collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, when millions perished in trenches dug from pride and fear, historians began to look backward. And there, amid the wreckage, they found the fragments she had left behind. Letters filled with warning, essays brimming with insight, testimonies of a lost path, a gentler empire that never was. In time, the world began to understand who she had been. She was the woman who believed in science before it became fashionable, who advocated for public health before epidemics forced change, who championed women's education while others confined them to drawing rooms. She was the mother who tried to guide a future emperor with reason, and who watched with open eyes as he walked into darkness. She was the consort who became her husband's voice, his memory, his archivist when history threatened to forget him. Her critics called her overbearing, foreign, naive. But history, which takes longer to judge, came to see her as something rarer, consistent. She had believed in constitutionalism from the moment she could read. She had defended it when she had the power to influence and when she had none. She had spoken for the voiceless, even when she herself was silenced. She left no crown behind, no lineage of power. Wilhelm's reign, which began in bluster, ended in exile. The world Victoria had tried to warn him against arrived with brutal clarity. War, collapse, revolution. And in the aftermath, a different Germany began to read her story, not because she had ruled, but because she had remembered. In the decades that followed, historians reevaluated the short reign of Friedrich III and the role Victoria had played. Scholars read her letters not as domestic trifles, but as political texts. Medical historians traced public health initiatives back to her patronage. Feminists studied her writings on education and autonomy. Even in Britain, where her legacy had once been obscured by the towering shadow of her mother, she came to be seen not just as the eldest daughter, but as an independent force, a bridge between monarchies, a witness to Europe's transformation. But perhaps her greatest legacy was this. She taught the world that memory is a form of resistance, that to write, to preserve, to speak the truth quietly and stubbornly, even when no one listens, is to leave behind a map for those who come later. She was not the queen who ruled an empire. She was the queen who remembered what it might have been. And in the slow arc of history, that was enough.